Every night for 6 months, billionaire Richard Hale returned home to silence. His 5-year-old son, Noah, hadn't spoken a word since the accident that took his mother's life. Until one evening, Richard walks in and finds Noah kneeling beside the housekeeper, toy stethoscope on her chest, whispering, "I'll heal you, Mummy." It wasn't said to Richard. It wasn't about him. But in that quiet moment, everything begins to unravel, truths buried, lies sold as science, and a bond forming between a child in grief and a woman with secrets of her own. What happens when healing doesn't come from medicine, but from presence? And what if the woman the world called dangerous is the only one who sees the boy for who he truly is? Stay with us, because this story isn't just about loss. It's about how love, even in disguise, can bring a voice back to the silent. Richard Hale stepped through the back entrance of his Westchester estate, slipping out of his blazer with a practiced motion, already loosening his tie as he entered the hallway. The late afternoon had been a continuation of every other corporate war he'd fought that month, sterile, high stakes, and utterly hollow. Neurowell's quarterly board meeting had dragged into its 5th hour, where men in suits praised their projections with grins as dry as the data. They toasted to expansion, market penetration, and clinical influence. Richard had smiled through it all, but his thoughts drifted as always to the upstairs hallway of this very house, where Emily used to sit cross-legged, folding Noah's clothes into ridiculous animal shapes. He hadn't set foot in that hallway in weeks. Emily had made this house a place with corners that smelled like childhood and Sunday pancakes. Since she died, the mansion had reverted to what it always wanted to be: cold. His son hadn't spoken in 6 months, not a word, not even a whimper. Richard had learned to manage silence like a spreadsheet, but today something shifted the moment he passed the living room archway. Something impossible, something that stopped him mid-step like a sudden punch to the chest. Noah was on the floor, not crumpled, not curled up in one of his frozen states, but kneeling, focused. His small hands were placed delicately on Grace's chest, the housekeeper, the woman Richard had hired through a silent agency referral and barely acknowledged since. She was lying flat on her back on the carpet, her arms relaxed by her sides, eyes closed as if in deep sleep. Noah, in a wrinkled pajama top and mismatched socks, wore the white plastic doctor's coat from a Halloween costume they'd almost skipped that year. The stethoscope, bright blue, cracked at the hinge, was pressed clumsily to her chest, his brow furrowed. He leaned forward with all the seriousness of a child who doesn't yet know how to play. Then his lips parted, voice soft, uneven, fragile, but real. "I'll heal you, Mommy." Richard's heart stalled. He blinked, uncertain if he'd heard what he thought he heard. It came again. "I'll heal you, Mommy." His son, his mute son, was speaking. Not to him, not in therapy, not during one of Evelyn Monroe's absurdly expensive ABA sessions, but here, to Grace, to a woman who wasn't even a therapist. Richard gripped the doorframe so hard his knuckles went white. Time slowed in a way that had nothing to do with sentimentality and everything to do with disbelief. He wanted to call out, to speak, but what did one say when their entire reality cracked open like thin ice underfoot? He watched as Grace slowly opened her eyes, moist with something she didn't dare let fall. She didn't move right away. She didn't startle or shift like someone caught in a forbidden act. She simply looked up at the boy with a kind of reverence, as if witnessing a moment too sacred to interrupt. Her hand rose, slow, deliberate, and touched Noah's small fingers where they held the stethoscope. Not to guide him, not to correct, just to hold. Noah didn't recoil. He didn't scream or flinch or pull away like he did every time Richard had tried to brush the hair from his forehead. He remained where he was, perfectly still, watching her with wide eyes that once again resembled the boy he'd been before Emily died. Richard felt heat rising in his chest, a bloom of something between jealousy and awe. Why her? Why now? And why not him? The silence that followed was deeper than any that had filled the house before, but it was not empty. It was loaded. Richard's mind flared with questions. Was this some kind of manipulation? Did Grace know about Noah's trauma response and set this up? It was absurd, but Evelyn had warned him repeatedly. Untrained individuals around children with severe diagnoses could trigger unpredictable behaviors, attachments, regression. But Noah wasn't regressing. He was present, engaged. He had initiated touch, speech, eye contact. The trifecta every doctor said he might never achieve again. And it hadn't happened in a $5,000 session behind a two-way mirror with a notebook in Richard's hand. It had happened on the living room carpet, with Grace. Richard's breath caught. Could the diagnosis have been wrong? Could he have been wrong? The thought made his throat tighten. He stepped back before he was seen, overwhelmed by the sheer emotional force of the realization clawing at him. Grace remained still, her voice steady when she finally spoke. "That's very good, sweetheart," she said, her voice barely audible. "You're doing just fine." Noah nodded, barely, but enough. Then he stood up, placing the stethoscope back around his neck like he'd seen on TV. Grace sat up slowly, careful not to break the rhythm of his calm. Richard couldn't bring himself to move. He felt like a stranger in his own home. A man who had signed every check, taken every medical meeting, followed every clinical recommendation, and yet had done nothing but watch his son disappear further with every passing day. And this woman, this housekeeper with her simple clothes and tired eyes, had cracked something open in the boy that no institution could touch. It felt like betrayal. It felt like salvation. It felt like both. Richard didn't step into the room. He couldn't. Not yet. Instead, he turned away quietly, walking back down the hallway like a man returning from the dead, each step echoing with doubt. He closed his office door behind him and sat at his desk in the dark, staring at nothing. For the first time in a long time, he didn't want to open a report. He didn't want to check his email or look at the NeuroWell portfolio. He wanted answers, but none of the places he usually turned to held them. How had he missed it? How had he not seen what Noah needed? Was he so buried in grief, in guilt, in work, that he'd stopped seeing his own son? Or had he never really known how to look in the first place? The image of Noah's little voice calling someone else Mommy would haunt him for days. But deeper than the ache was a seed of something new, curiosity. A question, not about his company, not about the science, but about the woman who had somehow reached his unreachable son. And so, the moment that began with a man walking into another day of silence ended differently this time. Richard Hale entered his silent mansion after another sterile board meeting at NeuroWell. He expected emptiness, but found something else entirely. His 5-year-old son, Noah, silent since his mother's death, was kneeling beside the housekeeper lying on the floor, toy stethoscope pressed to her chest. "I'll heal you, Mommy," he whispered. The words cracked through Richard's world like lightning. It was the first thing Noah had said in 6 months, and not to his father, but to Grace, the quiet woman he barely noticed. In that moment, Richard began to question everything he thought he knew about his son, grief, and what healing truly looks like. Richard didn't say anything the next morning. He watched from the kitchen doorway as Grace cleaned the breakfast nook in her usual quiet way, humming something he didn't recognize, low and soft, not meant for anyone, but somehow just loud enough to reach the ears of a 5-year-old boy sitting cross-legged in the next room. Noah wasn't playing. He wasn't fixated on his blocks or pacing along the tiles. He was watching her, carefully, as if her every movement held answers to questions he couldn't articulate. Richard folded his arms and narrowed his gaze. Who the hell was this woman? He'd barely registered her when she first arrived, just another agency hire, quiet, efficient, professional. She spoke only when spoken to, avoided eye contact with him entirely, and didn't linger in rooms unless she had a task to complete. But now his son, who hadn't let a therapist within 10 feet without screaming, was shadowing her movements like a duckling imprinting on a mother. Something didn't add up, not just with Noah, but with her. There was a weight to her silence that suddenly struck Richard as unnatural, like someone trained to erase herself. And that more than anything made him wary. He began asking quiet questions, not to Grace, but around her. He called the agency that had placed her. They confirmed the basics. Her name was Grace Wilkins. References clean, nothing notable. No social media presence, no criminal record. But something about the answers felt rehearsed, too tidy. Richard didn't get to where he was by trusting surface-level reports. He paid a former corporate security consultant, someone who once uncovered patent leaks in South Korea, to dig deeper. What came back chilled him. There was no Grace Wilkins with that birth date in any public database prior to 3 years ago. No tax records, no education history, no family. Just a blank space, like she'd appeared from nowhere. At the same time, Noah's transformation was accelerating. He started making humming sounds. He followed Grace from room to room, sitting quietly nearby while she folded laundry, cleaned windows, or chopped fruit. She never acknowledged him directly, never initiated contact. But she'd speak aloud when he was near, talking about how she folded shirts, which apples were best for baking, how to hum with your chest so it vibrated. And Noah listened. He mimicked her movements. He even smiled once. It wasn't much, but it was more than months of professional therapy had accomplished. The contrast was infuriating. Richard spent nights pacing his home office, rereading reports from Dr. Evelyn Monroe, his trusted friend and NeuroWell's lead behavioral consultant. She had confirmed the diagnosis of severe nonverbal autism, had insisted early intervention with structured therapy was the only viable path. And yet, here was Grace, unqualified, undocumented, unauthorized, doing what Evelyn's entire team hadn't. He didn't know what disturbed him more, that the diagnosis might be flawed, or that he, a man who'd built his career on innovation and logic, might have blindly accepted it without question. He didn't tell Evelyn about Grace. Not yet. He needed more. One evening, he hovered by the hallway and caught Grace humming the same tune from the morning. She was sweeping near the stairwell when she suddenly stopped, turned her head slightly, and said without looking up, "Is there something you'd like to ask me, Mr. Hale?" Her voice was calm, controlled. Not startled, not submissive. Richard was caught off guard by how steady it was. He cleared his throat, then lied. "Just wondering if Noah's bothering you." She shook her head gently. "Not at all. He's just listening." She continued sweeping. The next morning, he watched as Noah brought a crumpled napkin to the table, flattened it carefully, and began folding it the same way Grace had done the day before. He wasn't just mimicking movements. He was learning patterns, sequences, behaviors that required focus and processing. These were not the actions of a cognitively frozen child. Richard felt a wave of panic rise in his chest. Had he let grief blind him to his own son's reality? Or worse, had someone else exploited it? He went back to his office and pulled Noah's full case file, stacking up medical reports, therapy receipts, evaluations, thousands of dollars, hundreds of hours. And now all of it seemed to unravel with the slow unfolding of a napkin. He stared at the photo clipped to the top of one intake form. Noah, eyes empty, mouth slightly open. Not the boy he had just seen downstairs. The boy downstairs was coming back to life. And the person helping him was a woman who, officially, did not exist. The contradiction gnawed at him. Grace had no reason to help Noah the way she did. No bonus, no emotional investment. She barely spoke to Richard unless necessary. And yet Noah moved toward her like a plant bending to sunlight. That night, Richard sat in his room, laptop open, the security report glowing on the screen. One line stopped him cold. Possible match to Grace Thompson, former RN, license revoked after medical misconduct case at Mercy General Hospital. He clicked on the linked file, a grainy photo, similar eyes, similar. Same jawline, it could be her, but the article painted her in shades of scandal, accused of negligence after the death of a premature infant, stripped of her license, vanished shortly after the case. But Richard's gut twisted in a new direction. This wasn't just a lie. This was a reason. She had motive to hide, yes, but she also had experience, skill, medical knowledge that no cleaner from a household agency should possess. He stared at the screen, torn between two truths. One that painted her as a threat, and another that explained why Noah trusted her. A woman who had once held dying infants might know how to hold silent children. He shut the laptop and leaned back, heart pounding. If she was Grace Thompson, why here? Why now? And was her connection to Noah coincidence, or something else entirely? Richard becomes suspicious. Who is this woman his son speaks to? Grace Thompson keeps her distance, never oversteps, yet somehow Noah lingers near her, watching, following, mimicking. Grace, under a false name, works quietly and sings lullabies while cleaning. She never touches Noah, never asks anything of him, but her presence speaks in ways therapy never did. As Richard investigates her background, he uncovers inconsistencies. She's not who she says she is, and yet Noah is changing, healing, laughing even. The contradiction haunts Richard more than any business threat ever could. Grace stood at the edge of the property, arms folded loosely over her chest, gaze lifted toward the stars. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't even thinking, really. Just existing in the stillness of a moment that asked nothing of her. The darkness felt kinder than daylight, less complicated. Out here, no one demanded reports or looked at her with eyes already full of judgment. She breathed in, slow and even, and let the quiet settle over her like a familiar coat. A few seconds passed before she heard the faint crunch of small feet in the grass. She didn't turn, didn't speak. She simply kept breathing, the rhythm steady, and then, beside her, barely grazing her arm, was Noah. He didn't say a word. He never did. But he stood there, matching her posture, syncing his breath with hers, as if he'd been practicing. Grace shifted her eyes slightly to the side, not enough to scare him, just enough to acknowledge him. There was no need to fill the silence. It wasn't empty. It was his language, and she'd learned how to listen. His presence beside her felt deliberate, like he'd come not for words, but for something else, something simpler, something safe. Inside the house, behind the thick glass of the kitchen door, Richard watched them. He should have felt relief, should have been grateful his son was outside, not curled into himself in a hallway or frozen mid-step by the piano bench. But what he felt most was a knot in his chest that wouldn't loosen. He had offered everything to Noah, top-tier specialists, world-renowned therapists, carefully calibrated routines and diets. He had reshaped his calendar, redirected resources, poured money into solutions that promised miracles. And none of them had drawn Noah out like her. Grace, with no degrees on the wall, no sanctioned role in his life, no right to be the one standing beside his son under the stars. It burned more than he wanted to admit. Why her? Why not him? Why couldn't he be the one Noah reached for, breathed with, mirrored? That ache went deeper than pride. It was rooted in years of absence dressed up as sacrifice. Every late-night email, every missed bedtime, every "I'll be home soon" that turned into tomorrow. He hadn't been there. Not really. And now, when his son finally re-emerged, it wasn't to him. He stepped away from the window and leaned against the marble counter, the tension in his jaw so tight it ached. He hadn't cried when Emily died, not because he didn't feel it, but because grief had no room in the structure of his world. It was inefficient, messy, He had taken on the role of organizer, protector, decider, the one who handled arrangements and logistics and therapy schedules. He had moved forward when Noah couldn't, and maybe he thought that would be enough. But watching his son choose to stand beside Grace, to breathe beside her, felt like punishment for all the ways he had failed quietly, in increments too small to stop at the time. Guilt clawed its way up his throat like a rising tide. What could Grace possibly have that he didn't? How had she found a way in through the silence? And if she had, did that mean Noah had never been unreachable, just waiting for the right kind of reaching? That thought made Richard dizzy. He braced his hands on the counter, unsure if he was angry at Grace, or angry at himself for needing her to fail. Outside, Grace remained still, but her presence was active. She could feel Noah's breathing deepen, falling into sync with hers more easily now. He hadn't moved away when she stepped slightly closer. That alone was progress. She had no desire to break the silence, not here, not now. It was sacred. It wasn't that she didn't have things to say. She did, so many, but they weren't the kind that helped boys like Noah. Words had failed him, failed her, failed so many who needed softness, not structure. So she gave him rhythm, space, patience. She didn't know what Richard thought of her. He'd been distant lately, colder than usual, like he was holding something back, but she hadn't come to this house to win anyone over. She had come because she needed work, because it was the only way to survive. And now, somehow, she had found herself here, with a child who trusted her enough to breathe beside her. That was a kind of grace she didn't think she'd ever earn again. She didn't take it lightly, didn't assume it would last. But tonight, it was real, and it was enough. Richard returned to the window just in time to see it happen. Grace, with one small movement, tilted her head and began to hum. Just one line, one familiar phrase, quiet and steady. The same lullaby she had been humming in the kitchen the day Noah first followed her. She didn't look at him, didn't coax, just hummed. And Noah, without hesitation, leaned his head gently against her shoulder. His body relaxed, his face softened. He didn't speak, but the gesture said everything. Richard's breath caught in his throat. It was a moment he should have cherished, should have felt joy over, but instead it hollowed him, not because he was jealous, but because he realized just how much had been lost in all the things he thought he was doing right. This woman, this stranger, had stepped into his home and reminded his son what safety felt like. Richard felt like a stranger in his own family, and for the first time he envied something no money could buy: trust. Grace stands on the edge of the Hale estate's backyard one night, watching the stars. Noah appears beside her. He doesn't speak, but mimics her breathing, her stillness. Richard watches from a distance, confused and hurt. Why her? Why not him? The guilt of absence claws at him, boardrooms over birthdays, hospitals over hugs. That night, Grace hums a lullaby, and Noah leans his head on her shoulder. Richard feels like a stranger in his own family, and for the first time, envies something money cannot buy: trust. Grace hadn't planned to go through the office that day. It wasn't part of her usual routine. Richard rarely let anyone clean in there, and when he did, it was with the unspoken agreement that nothing be touched beyond surface level. But that afternoon, after the laundry had been folded and Noah was quietly assembling a puzzle by the kitchen table, she noticed the office door slightly ajar, a rare thing. Her first instinct was to leave it alone, but something pulled her toward it. Perhaps it was the need to keep her hands busy, to stay useful, to avoid thinking too hard about what Noah had begun to mean to her. She stepped in with quiet intention, dusting along the windowsill, the desk, the baseboards. Everything was neat, almost obsessively so, except for one spot on the bookshelf where medical journals were crammed in tightly. As she adjusted a crooked one, a thick manila folder slid out from behind the row. It wasn't labeled, just a plain, dusty file with a small tear at the corner. She turned it over in her hands, hesitated, and opened it. What she read inside stopped her cold. Her breath hitched, and her hands began to shake. The report was dated 3 months after the accident that took Emily Hale's life. The heading was from a private trauma specialist, Dr. Anthony Valdez, MD, Pediatric Neuropsychiatry and Trauma Unit. It was a full psychological and sensory assessment on Noah. The findings were methodical, thorough, and clear. Noah's silence was not indicative of autism spectrum disorder. It was a trauma-induced mutism directly tied to the shock of witnessing his mother's death. The report emphasized the need for gentle reintroduction to sensory engagement, a stable emotional environment, and above all, time. It explicitly warned against unnecessary medicalization. The prognosis was listed as excellent with appropriate intervention. But at the bottom of the last page, scribbled in blue ink in the margin, was a note forwarded to Dr. Evelyn Monroe, Neuro Well. Grace's mouth went dry, her knees weakened. Evelyn. It was always Evelyn. She pressed her hand to her chest, trying to catch her breath. This couldn't be real, not again. Not another life twisted by that woman's clinical convenience. She had destroyed Grace once, stolen her name, her career, her daughter, and now she had done it to Noah, to this child who had just begun to feel safe again. Grace sat down on the arm of the leather chair, the report open in her lap, trying to piece together the timeline. The official diagnosis Evelyn had delivered to Richard was definitive. Severe autism, nonverbal, lifelong care required. That diagnosis had rewritten Noah's future and locked him into a world of therapists, medications, and interventions that only deepened his isolation. But it had been built on a lie, or worse, on a truth intentionally buried. Grace had seen this before. She remembered the board meeting at Mercy General, Evelyn standing in front of the panel with her signature certainty, dismissing Grace's protests, twisting the facts until the death of a fragile newborn fell squarely at her feet. And now, years later, Evelyn had done it again, reframed trauma as disorder, cashed in on fear, and used a grieving father's trust as leverage. Grace's fingers curled around the edge of the folder. She couldn't unsee it, couldn't pretend she hadn't found it. But telling Richard the truth could unravel everything. She was here under a false name. If he turned on her, she would lose not just her job, but Noah. The thought hit harder than she expected. He wasn't her son, but he had begun to feel like something close. Still, hiding it would make her complicit. That she couldn't live with. Grace moved quickly, pulling her phone from her apron pocket and snapping photos of each page, double-checking to ensure every corner was legible. Her hands were steadier now, powered by something deeper than fear. When she finished, she placed the file back exactly where she'd found it, pressing it into the tight space between the journals so it would go unnoticed. She stepped back, adjusted the crooked spine of the book that had started it all, and closed the office door behind her. The silence in the hallway felt heavier now, like a held breath. She walked past Noah, who looked up at her from his puzzle, eyes curious. She smiled, tight, too careful, and he returned it faintly before returning to his task. He didn't know what had shifted, not yet. But Grace felt the full weight of it. The secret in her phone was a bombshell, and it was only a matter of time before she had to choose between survival and truth. She wiped her hands on her apron and glanced toward the upstairs hallway. Richard would be home soon. When Richard arrived, she didn't approach him immediately. Instead, she sat at the table while Noah napped upstairs, staring at the phone in her hand, trying to find the right words. Not just to explain the report, but to reveal who she really was. She rehearsed it again and again in her mind. I know you don't really know me. I've lied to you, but I had no choice. Please just read this first. None of it sounded right. None of it felt like enough. She heard Richard come downstairs, heard the cabinet doors open, the glass of something poured. She stood. She walked to his office. She knocked, softly. He opened the door with a neutral expression, surprised but not unfriendly. "I need to show you something," she said. He hesitated, one hand still on the doorknob. "It's about Noah," she added. That changed everything. His face stiffened, and he gestured for her to come in. She knew this might be the end of her time in this house. But if there was even a chance of pulling Noah back from the brink, if there was even a thread of justice to unravel, she had to try. She had to, even if it cost her everything. While cleaning Richard's office, Grace finds a dusty folder tucked behind medical journals, a confidential assessment from a child trauma specialist dated 3 months after the accident. It contradicts everything. Noah was not autistic. His silence was a trauma response. A note in the corner, forwarded to Dr. Evelyn Monroe. Grace's hands tremble. The same doctor who ruined her life had done it again, this time to a child. She copies the report and decides to tell Richard, knowing it could cost her the only place she has felt safe in years. Richard didn't waste time. The moment Grace left his office, after showing him the photographs of the hidden report, he sat in silence for 10 long minutes, processing, resisting, then finally accepting what he'd seen. The signature was clear, the findings indisputable, and the name at the bottom of the margin forwarded to Dr. Evelyn Monroe. That name hit harder than anything else. She had been his confidant, his expert, his long-trusted advisor through the worst 6 months of his life. She had stood in front of him in boardrooms and therapy consultations and said, with complete clinical authority, that his son would never speak again, never connect, never live a normal life. And he had believed her. He had built his entire response, his entire parenting approach, on that belief. Now he knew it had been built on rot. He called her from his office, tone even but tight. "We need to talk, now." Evelyn didn't hesitate. She arrived within the hour, stepping into his home like she always had, confident, polished, utterly unreadable. But this time, Richard was ready. No charm. No pleasantries, just the folder laid out on the table. Her smile didn't falter. Instead, she leaned forward and said calmly, "You shouldn't have let her near your son." "She's not who she says she is, Richard," Evelyn continued, voice velvet smooth. "You think this is a discovery. It's a manipulation. She's dangerous. She lost her license for a reason." Richard didn't respond at first. He studied her, noting the ease with which she turned concern into accusation, the way she shifted the focus entirely to Grace, without once acknowledging the contents of the report. "So, you're not going to address this?" he asked finally, tapping the page with Dr. Valdez's signature. Evelyn sighed, as if indulging a child. "Trauma responses are complex. What you're reading is one opinion and, frankly, not a very reliable one. That report was premature. I didn't forward it to you because I didn't want to confuse the treatment plan. But the gaslighting came so naturally, it frightened him. You withheld a contradictory diagnosis," he said, his voice rising slightly. "You allowed my son to be medicated, isolated, labeled, on purpose." Evelyn's expression cooled. "I protected your company, Richard, and your reputation. If the public found out that the CEO of Neurowell was ignoring a clear ASD diagnosis in his own child," she trailed off, letting the threat hang in the air like smoke. That was the moment Richard knew, truly knew, that Evelyn had never been on his side, not as a friend, not as a doctor, not as anything except a strategist playing a long game. She didn't see Noah as a child. She saw him as a case study, a marketing asset. CEO trusts our methods. Even for his own son, it was perfect branding. Richard's hands curled into fists beneath the table. "You used him," he said flatly. Evelyn blinked. "I used what I had to make sure he got the best possible care. That's what you paid me for." Her honesty was brutal, shameless. He could see it now. So many children pushed through Neurowell's pilot programs, families kept quiet with glossy reports and industry buzzwords, all under her guidance, all to serve growth. "Get out," he said, low and certain. Evelyn stood slowly, as if disappointed. "You're making a mistake. Grace is unstable. If she gets too close, get out." She didn't argue. She simply picked up her coat, adjusted the cuffs, and walked out of the house, leaving behind only the smell of expensive perfume and the echo of something irreparably broken. Richard didn't move for a long time. The house felt quieter than usual, but it wasn't empty. It was charged. Something inside him had ruptured, some tether between trust and denial. He opened his laptop and began to search, not on public sites, not on Neurowell servers. He used secure investigative contacts, former corporate intel analysts, people he usually hired to root out financial fraud. Within days, he had documents, email chains, payment records. Evelyn had been receiving payments disguised as consulting fees from 3 pharmaceutical suppliers affiliated with Neurowell's pediatric wing. Worse, she had submitted at least 7 other ASD diagnoses in the last 2 years with similar language and identical treatment paths. High cost, long-term, brand-specific. Each family's child had been folded into research trials without proper disclosure. What he was looking at wasn't a mistake, it was a system, a carefully built web of misdiagnosis, financial incentives, and silenced doubts. In every folder, every line item, he saw the same pattern, and right in the center, connecting every dot, was Evelyn Monroe. Her fingerprints were on everything, including Noah's life. That night, Richard stood in the doorway of Noah's bedroom, watching his son sleep. The boy's hand clutched the stuffed dinosaur Grace had mended weeks ago. His lips were parted slightly, breath soft. He didn't look sick. He didn't look damaged. He looked small, vulnerable, beautiful. Richard felt something inside him crumble. For so long, he had seen Noah through a clinical lens, waiting for symptoms, tracking behaviors, chasing benchmarks. He had let his grief blind him, let a professional tell him who his son was. But now, watching him sleep, Richard didn't see a case or a burden. He saw a child, a boy who had lost his mother, been drowned in silence, and now, somehow, was beginning to resurface. Not because of pills or protocols, but because of patience, because someone sat beside him in stillness, because someone didn't try to fix him. Richard felt the sting of tears behind his eyes and didn't blink them away. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel it fully: shame, fury, and something else. Resolve. He hadn't fought for Noah, not really, but that would change. Richard confronts Evelyn Monroe. She gaslights, warns, threatens. Grace is dangerous. She's manipulating your son. But Richard no longer sees Grace as a liability. He starts digging. What he finds devastates him. Records of questionable diagnoses, payments hidden as consulting fees, children's lives rerouted by greed. And in the middle of it all, his son. Evelyn had used Noah as a pharmaceutical showcase, a living endorsement. That night, Richard watches his son sleep and finally sees him, not as a case or a problem, but as a boy who lost his mother and needs his father to fight for him. The headlines hit like a slap to the face. Richard saw them first on his phone, a barrage of push notifications that multiplied with every minute. Disgraced nurse found working with vulnerable CEO's child. Grace Thompson, former RN, fired after infant's death, hired under alias by Hale family. Where was the due diligence? The timing wasn't just suspicious, it was strategic. The language, the angle, the way photos had been selected to show Grace at her most severe, most guilty looking. It all had Evelyn's fingerprints. Richard knew it before he read the bylines. He sat at the kitchen table, one hand covering his mouth, the other gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles whitened. Grace hadn't even come downstairs yet. When she finally did, her expression didn't show surprise, just a quiet acceptance, as if she had been waiting for the storm to arrive. He tried to speak, but nothing came. She walked past him without a word, heading upstairs. Noah was in his room, humming softly, assembling his blocks with the same precision he always used when the world felt unpredictable. Grace knocked softly on his door, stepped inside, and closed it gently behind her. She didn't tell him what was happening, but she didn't need to. An hour later, Child Protective Services arrived. They were polite, procedural, even apologetic, but firm. "We received an anonymous report," one of the agents said. "Given the child's special needs status and Ms. Thompson's unresolved history, protocol requires temporary separation pending investigation." Richard argued, of course. He showed them the report from Dr. Valdez, the real diagnosis. He explained the manipulation, the context, even Evelyn's role. But it didn't matter. None of it changed the fact that Grace had used a false name and withheld a disqualifying event from her past. "We're not accusing anyone of wrongdoing," the lead investigator said gently, "but we have to follow process." Grace didn't fight it. She nodded, thanked them, and went upstairs to pack. Richard followed her, standing in the doorway of the guest room that had slowly become hers. "I'll fix this," he said, voice tight. "You shouldn't have to go." Grace looked at him, 1,000 thoughts behind her eyes. "You don't need to fix it," she replied. "You just need to be here for him." Her voice didn't crack. Not yet. She folded her clothes in careful silence, and Richard hated how much it reminded him of her presence, how even her exits were quiet, like she didn't want to disturb the furniture or anyone's life. Noah sat halfway up the stairs, knees pulled into his chest, arms wrapped tightly around the toy stethoscope he never let go of now. He hadn't cried. Not yet. He just stared as Grace walked down with her small suitcase. She paused when she saw him, set the suitcase down, crouched beside the railing. "Hey," she said softly, "I'm going to be gone for a little while, okay?" Noah didn't respond. His lips were pressed together, his jaw locked. She reached out slowly, not to touch him, just to rest her hand on the railing closest to his. "You didn't do anything wrong," she whispered. "This isn't because of you. It's just something I have to take care of. But I'll be back, I promise." She waited. No response. Just a hard stare and that small hand gripping the stethoscope like it was oxygen. Grace blinked quickly, stood, grabbed her suitcase, and continued toward the door. Richard watched from behind, helpless. As she stepped out, he realized how quiet the house had become. It wasn't peaceful, it was gutted. The kind of silence that comes after something vital has been pulled out, and the walls haven't caught up yet. That night, Richard sat in Noah's room long after bedtime. The boy hadn't eaten, hadn't spoken, hadn't built anything. He just lay curled on his side, his arms wrapped around a pillow, the stethoscope between them. Richard tried. He read from one of Noah's books, tried the routine Grace had suggested, humming, gentle back rubs, breathing exercises. Nothing worked. He left the room just after midnight, frustrated and exhausted, only to be pulled back 15 minutes later by a scream so sharp it sliced through the second floor. "Grace!" Noah's voice tore from his throat like it had been trapped too long. "Grace! Grace!" Richard rushed in, finding Noah on the floor, clutching the stethoscope, kicking, hitting the side of the bed with his fists. "Grace, come back!" It was the first time he'd ever said her name, the first time Richard had ever heard his son cry out with such clarity. But there was no relief in it, only agony. Richard tried to hold him, tried to whisper that she'd be back, but Noah thrashed, inconsolable, as if the act of calling her had opened a wound that wouldn't close. The screams eventually became sobs, then hiccups, then silence. But not the silence of sleep or peace. It was the broken silence that comes after a storm, where everything has been torn apart, but nothing is yet rebuilt. Richard sat on the edge of the bed, feeling like a failure all over again. Grace had once told him that Noah didn't need fixing. He needed someone to stay, and yet here they were, another adult gone, another promise in limbo. Richard felt helpless in a way that no money, no lawyer, no therapy could fix. He stayed there until Noah finally passed out from exhaustion, his tear-stained cheek pressed against the mattress, the toy stethoscope still gripped in his hand like a lifeline. Richard didn't leave. He couldn't. Because somewhere inside the echo of that scream, he had finally understood something. The presence of one woman had become the anchor to his son's fragile healing. And now the anchor was gone. No songs, no hums, no soft voice at bedtime. The music had stopped. And the silence that returned fell harder than ever before. A smear campaign begins. Grace's past is leaked to the press. Headlines scream, "Disgraced nurse found working with vulnerable child." Child Protective Services show up. Protocol demands she leave the house pending investigation. Grace packs silently. Noah watches from the stairs, clutching the toy stethoscope. She whispers to him, "I'll be back, I promise." That night, Noah screams her name. It's the first time he speaks it. Richard tries to comfort him, but he's inconsolable. The music has stopped, and silence falls harder than before. Noah was disappearing again, and this time it was faster than before. In the days after Grace was removed from the house, Richard watched helplessly as his son unraveled. The progress they'd clawed toward, his smiles, the humming, even the brief spark of laughter, collapsed like it had never existed. Noah refused food, turning his head away from every plate. He wouldn't sleep unless exhaustion knocked him out cold, and even then it was short, restless. The worst part came when Richard found him in the hallway one night, forehead pressed against the wall, hitting it rhythmically with small, forceful movements. Panic surged through him. He scooped Noah into his arms, but the boy thrashed and screamed, not words, not even sounds that resembled anything coherent, just raw, terrified anguish. It shattered Richard in a way he didn't know he could be broken. All the money, the power, the control, none of it mattered. His son was in pain, not because of a diagnosis, not because of his mind, but because someone he trusted had been taken away. That night, sitting on the cold floor outside Noah's bedroom, Richard made a decision. He wasn't going to wait for the system to fix itself. He would burn it down. By the following morning, Richard had called every connection he had. He wasn't careful. He wasn't subtle. He didn't care about optics or liability anymore. He hired a full legal team outside of NeuroWell's influence. Independent, expensive, relentless. Investigators followed. He tracked whistleblowers who had left NeuroWell under suspicious circumstances, former parents who had once publicly praised Evelyn Monroe, but privately raised red flags. It was all there, just under the surface, waiting for someone with enough power and no fear of losing it. The truth came in pieces. Evelyn had falsified reports, rewritten psychological evaluations, manipulated families into accepting diagnoses that benefited drug trials. In exchange, she received consulting contracts, speaking fees, private bonuses from pharmaceutical partners, masked as research stipends. And Grace had been her casualty long before Noah. Evelyn had scapegoated her in a neonatal death that autopsy reports now clearly attributed to a congenital heart defect. The documents had been suppressed. Grace had been ruined to protect a partnership. Richard stared at the files, disbelief curdling into rage. He thought of how many nights he'd left Noah in silence, blaming the child's brokenness, when the real damage had come from adults who were never held accountable. The board at NeuroWell was the first to feel the heat. Richard didn't consult them. He dropped the first set of documents directly to a journalist at the Herald-Post, one of the few investigative outlets that still had teeth. The article went live within 48 hours. Headlines blazed, "Pharmaceutical fraud, children misdiagnosed for profit." Evelyn's name was front and center, Richard's too. The press descended. Within a day, the board called an emergency session. Richard didn't attend. He didn't offer statements. He didn't try to save face. He'd stopped playing that game. He knew they would panic, that they'd distance themselves from Evelyn, from him, from the entire pediatric division. Lawsuits were inevitable. Stocks would take a hit. But he no longer cared. The empire Evelyn had built, on data, on influence, on the backs of vulnerable families, was collapsing. And Richard was the one holding the match. Every step he took now was about one thing: getting Grace back and saving what was left of his son's spirit. He didn't want control anymore. He wanted truth, and he wanted healing, whatever the cost. That shift inside him was final. This wasn't damage control, this was war. He made a direct call to the district attorney's office, offering full cooperation. Names, documents, internal communications. Richard knew the cost. His name was all over those approvals. At the very least, his silence had enabled Evelyn's rise. But when the lead prosecutor asked, "Are you ready to be publicly accountable for your part?" Richard didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. "Just make sure she never does this to another child again." That night, he told his legal team to prepare for depositions. He authorized full release of internal emails. He issued a personal statement admitting his failure, not just as CEO, but as a father. The media went wild. Pundits speculated about Neurowell's collapse. Former employees surfaced with more stories. Each new revelation made the picture clearer. Evelyn's influence had run deeper than anyone had dared admit, and Richard had been the respectable face that gave her unchecked power. Now, that face was changing. He was no longer protecting the company. He was tearing it apart to rebuild something that might one day be worthy of his son's trust. Meanwhile, Noah's condition remained fragile. He had stopped speaking again. Even the brief scream of Grace's name had become a memory. Richard stayed close, read to him, tried to cook the foods Grace used to prepare, played recordings of her humming that he'd saved without even realizing. Some nights, Noah curled up against him. Others, he didn't want to be touched at all, but Richard didn't leave. Not this time. He sat through every meltdown, every silence, every backward step. And in those moments, he understood that being present wasn't about fixing the pain. It was about refusing to walk away from it. He had walked away too many times before. From Emily, from Noah, from himself. Now he would stay, no matter how long it took. Grace had taught him that. Her absence screamed in every corner of the house, and yet her presence was everywhere. In the routines Noah missed, in the songs Richard hummed awkwardly, in the resolve that hardened in his chest every time he felt like giving up. He didn't know when or if Grace would return. But he knew one thing: he would make sure the world was different when she did. Noah begins to regress, stops eating, stops sleeping, begins harming himself. Richard acts. He hires investigators, lawyers, whistleblowers. The truth comes out piece by piece. Grace was innocent. Evelyn had falsified reports, manipulated outcomes, and destroyed lives. Richard leaks it all to the press. The empire Evelyn built begins to crumble. Lawsuits are filed. Neurowell's board panics. But Richard doesn't care. For the first time in his life, he isn't trying to win. He's trying to save his son. Richard hadn't slept in 2 nights. Not well, at least. Not since the last legal filing went public, not since Evelyn's public resignation, not since he read the final report clearing Grace's name. The moment he got the call that the investigation was officially closed and she was free to return, he didn't wait for anyone else to act. He got in the car, drove across state lines without telling his staff or legal team, and found her at the modest borrowed apartment where she'd been staying with a retired nurse friend. When she opened the door, she looked at him like someone who didn't know if they were being invited home or warned away. "It's over," he said. "They cleared you. Everything's public now." She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She only asked one thing. "How is he?" Richard hesitated. "Waiting," he said. Grace nodded. She didn't pack much, just a bag, a sweater, a notebook. On the drive back, they didn't speak much either. The silence wasn't heavy. It was full. Richard glanced at her once, his hands tight on the wheel. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you." Grace didn't respond right away. Then, "You protected him, that's what matters." When they pulled into the Hale driveway, Richard's hands were shaking. He hadn't realized it until he tried to unlock the door and fumbled the keys. Grace stepped inside first, slowly, cautiously. The house had been kept clean, but without her, it had lost something harder to describe. She knew it immediately. Something about the way the air felt paused, like the breath of a child holding in pain. Noah wasn't in the living room, not in the kitchen. Richard led her upstairs, then to the playroom, but it was empty. Finally, they found him in the far corner of his bedroom, curled into himself, arms wrapped around his knees, the toy stethoscope looped around his neck like a shield. He didn't look up. His body rocked slowly, methodically. It was a rhythm Grace recognized too well. Not from textbooks, but from children she had once held through nights of fever and fear. She crouched low but didn't speak. Not yet. She took a slow breath. And then she hummed, not a new song, but the lullaby she always sang while folding laundry, the one he'd once repeated under his breath while hiding behind the couch. She didn't reach for him. She just sang, waiting. For several minutes, nothing happened. Richard stood frozen behind them, torn between hope and dread. Grace's voice didn't waver. She didn't watch Noah. Her gaze stayed soft, unfocused, as if singing for herself. Eventually the rocking slowed. Noah's hand twitched, his head tilted slightly. Then cautiously, his eyes found her. He didn't smile, he didn't run, he simply stared. And then, like he was checking against a memory, he took one step forward, then another, and then he stumbled into her arms, no fanfare, no sobs. Just the quiet exhale of breath against her shoulder as his body rested into hers, like a puzzle piece falling into place. Grace didn't cry, though her lips trembled. She held him tightly, not to contain him, but to let him know she wasn't leaving. Richard felt something crack in his chest, something tight and old. He stepped back quietly, allowing the moment to belong only to them. He understood now that love wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was made of lullabies in silence and small feet crossing small distances that meant everything. Days passed, and something in the house began to shift. Grace didn't just return, she rerouted. CPS cleared her fully after the public exoneration. The media fire had moved on, Evelyn's empire lay in ruins, and Richard had formally resigned as CEO of Neurowell, issuing a public letter about ethics, failures, and second chances. Grace, however, never commented to the press. She didn't want applause or vindication. She wanted Noah. She wanted healing, and Noah responded. He began eating again, sleeping without night terrors. One evening, he reached for her hand without prompting, pressing his fingers into hers like a seal. Grace didn't speak. She only squeezed gently and let it happen. Richard watched it all unfold from doorways and shadows, realizing that no court decision or corporate scandal had as much power as this quiet reconnection. This small boy, once voiceless, was finding himself not through therapy plans or protocols, but through presence, through a woman who had simply stayed when everyone else gave up. Later that week, the medical board issued a formal reinstatement of Grace's nursing license. The letter was delivered by hand. She read it alone in the kitchen, then tucked it into a drawer without comment. Richard found it later. When he asked her why she hadn't told him, she shrugged. "It's just a piece of paper," she said. "What matters is in that room." She nodded toward Noah's bedroom, where laughter had started to return in bursts, uneven but real. Grace had been cleared, yes, but the healing hadn't come from a board of professionals. It had come from the boy who once rocked in silence now, curling into her lap during bedtime stories. It came from trust, from slowness, from being believed. And while Richard had been the man with all the power, it was Grace who had taught them both how to truly hold it, with gentleness, not force. She hadn't saved Noah through brilliance or strategy. She had saved him by not leaving, and now he reached for her not out of fear, but choice. Richard drives across state lines to bring Grace back himself. When they enter the house, Noah is in the corner, rocking, silent. Grace kneels, sings their song, and waits. Slowly Noah looks up, steps forward, falls into her arms. It's not dramatic, it's quiet, but absolute. A bridge rebuilt. Grace is reinstated as a nurse. The truth clears her name, but what matters most to her is the small hand that now reaches for hers without fear. The house that once echoed with loneliness now pulses with warmth. Years pass quietly, not in silence, but in the soft noise of healing. The Hale residence no longer bears the sterile weight of a mansion. It breathes now. Its walls hold not whispers of grief, but echoes of laughter, piano keys, the occasional teenage sarcasm, and the way Grace still hums when she folds laundry. Noah, now 15, stands nearly eye to eye with Richard and has grown into a boy who speaks with careful words and deep meaning. His voice, once lost in trauma, now holds weight when he chooses to use it. Grace never tried to rush that journey. She waited, and because she did, he walked it at his own pace, one word at a time. Richard, once a man of sealed conference rooms and cold decisions, has grown too. His days now orbit around something far more urgent than quarterly earnings: integrity. He stepped away from NeuroWell for good and built something new in its place, the Hale Foundation for Ethical Pediatric Care, with Grace at its helm. Their mission is simple: protect the voiceless, give power to families, and ensure no child is ever silenced by profit again. It started with one lie, but what followed was truth, reclaimed and rebuilt. Tonight is the Foundation's 5th anniversary gala, and though the room is dressed in expensive lighting and quiet luxury, the heart of the night is unmistakable. This is not a celebration of wealth or status, it's a declaration of survival. Grace stands backstage, clipboard in hand, her hair pulled back, more confident now than ever. She's respected not just for what she endured, but for what she did with it. Richard stands beside her, adjusting his cufflinks, but his eyes are fixed on Noah, who's quietly preparing his notes near the curtain. He's grown taller this year, his voice deeper, but his hands still fidget with the familiar toy stethoscope looped around his wrist like a bracelet. "You sure about this?" Richard asks softly. Noah nods, but his voice cracks slightly when he says, "Yeah, I want to say it out loud, for her." Grace hears it, but doesn't interrupt. She simply places a hand on his shoulder. "Whatever you say tonight," she whispers, "just let it be yours." Noah nods again, this time firmer. Then the music fades, and his name is announced. He walks onto the stage with a calm that surprises even himself. The lights don't blind him. The crowd doesn't shake him. He grips the microphone with both hands, glancing at the front row where Grace and Richard sit, side by side. The stethoscope hangs from his wrist, old and worn, but it feels like a part of him. He clears his throat, then speaks. "I don't remember much about the crash," he begins, "but I remember the silence afterward. Not outside, inside me. Everyone around me thought I had disappeared into something unfixable." He pauses, scanning the room. "But I wasn't broken. I was grieving. And grief isn't a condition. It's love with nowhere to go." His voice wavers, then steadies. "People tried to diagnose me, label me, medicate me. But the truth is, I didn't need to be solved. I needed someone to sit beside me in the quiet, someone to see me, even when I couldn't speak." He lifts the toy stethoscope, holding it up to the crowd. This is the first thing I picked up when I started finding my voice again. And I didn't press it to someone's chest because I knew how to heal. I did it because someone stayed long enough for me to believe I could. The audience is still for a breathless moment, caught in the honesty of his words. Then, as if exhaling all at once, the applause begins, not polite or performative, but thunderous and tear-filled. Grace lowers her head, overwhelmed. Richard places his hand over hers, their fingers curling together in the same silent promise they made, the day they brought her home for good. They would never let Noah feel unseen again. Journalists wipe tears. Doctors in the room shift uncomfortably, some recognizing their own complicity. But tonight isn't about blame. It's about truth. And truth has a face now, a voice, a name, and that name belongs to the boy who stopped speaking when his world shattered and began again when someone refused to walk away. After the applause fades, Noah steps down and walks directly to Grace. He doesn't speak, doesn't need to. He simply hands her the stethoscope. "For your office," he says. She takes it like it's made of glass. After the gala ends and the last donors leave, the three of them stay behind to finish the final touches. Noah takes off his tie and loosens his shirt collar, finally allowed to be a teenager again. Grace moves slowly through the crowd of flowers and abandoned programs, holding the stethoscope with both hands like a relic. "You realize what he just did, don't you?" Richard says quietly as he watches his son help a caterer carry boxes to the hallway. Grace nods. "He rewrote the story," she says. On his own terms." Richard looks at her, the weight of everything they've been through present in his gaze. "And you gave him the space to do it." She meets his eyes, then gestures toward the stethoscope. "No, he gave that to himself. I just stayed." For a long moment, neither says anything more. They just stand there, watching the boy who had once collapsed into silence now walk freely across the stage he built, with every quiet step back to life. Years pass. The house is no longer a mansion. It's a home. Laughter returns to its halls. Noah grows stronger, his voice steady. Grace, now officially family, becomes director of the Hale Foundation for Ethical Pediatric Care, founded by Richard in the wake of the scandal. At a foundation gala, a teenage Noah steps onto the stage. He holds up the same toy stethoscope and looks at the crowd. "I stopped speaking when my world broke," he says, voice firm. "And I started healing the day someone stopped trying to fix me and simply stayed." Tears flow. Applause rises. Grace and Richard sit in the front row, hands intertwined. What began as a lie unraveled into truth, and in that truth, a family was born. We put so much heart into bringing this story to life, not just as a team, but as a family who believes in the power of healing, truth, and second chances. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us keep sharing meaningful stories like this one. Explore more videos here on the channel, and don't forget to leave us a comment. We'd love to hear what this story meant to you. Every like, every word you share makes all the difference. Thank you for being part of this with us.